Okay, so in this video, I'm not going to speak as excited as I normally do because I am
Mm.
really excited about this
Okay.
topic. I love to talk about Greek language and stuff, and obviously, but my baby's sleeping,
Okay.
so so in the interest of not waking up my baby, um, I'm going to kind of speak more softly right
Okay.
now. But this is a very exciting thing. Okay, so.
Okay. Okay.
Um, so this book is called The Greek Article.
Mm.
It's by it says the series editor of this of the series is Stanley Porter,
Mm-hmm.
but the person who wrote this book is Ronald Peters. So this
Mm.
is called The Greek Article, a functional grammar of, oh, whoops, hang on, make it full screen and it does this.
Mm.
Um, the Greek Article, a functional grammar of Omicron items, or the article all items in the Greek New Testament with special emphasis on the Greek article.
Mm.
Okay, so I know that's a mouthful. Basically, it's about the Greek article and its function. This is published by Brill in 2014.
Mm.
Um, Now, the way I've been teaching Greek is I would normally go off what we learned in seminary, like what we
Mm.
learned from our Greek classes, what I learned from Wallace. And that's basically, there's a lot of functions of the article that we can ascertain that we
Mm.
know, but in general, we still don't quite understand why the article does all the things it does the way it does it.
Mm.
However, this book, I think, actually presents a pretty good case for understanding pretty much the way the article works.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to take you through some key parts of this book.
Okay.
And so we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
So there's basically two different main usages of the article. One is whenever it's modifying something that's not a noun, and the other is when
Mm.
it modifies a noun. So let's first talk about how it's functioning when it's modifying something not a noun. Here's what he says at the beginning of chapter 6 in his book. He says, there is a certain irony regarding the basic, quote unquote, function of the article. On the one hand, it is widely accepted that it primarily functions as a modifier, and that modification it produces is essentially that of substantivization.
Mm.
In other words, if you put the article in front of a part of speech that's not a noun, it will
Mm.
make it act like a noun.
Mm.
So, like if I used an adjective like good, if I said agathos, if I said all agathos anthropos, or sorry, if I said all agathos, that would be like the good, and then or the good person, and so
Mm.
it substantivalizes something that's not a noun. On
Mm.
the other hand, this function is not recognized as the article's defining function, and that's because what do you do when the article already is modifying a noun, right? And we'll get to that in just a
Mm.
second, but let's
Yeah.
finish this.
Mm.
Under the category of the use of the article as a substantivizer with certain parts of speech, Wallace writes, the article can turn almost any part of speech into a noun. So that's basically what he means here by this, is that it can turn a part of speech into a noun or
Mm.
acting like a noun. As true
Right.
as this statement may be, in actual usage, the article is used to modify nouns more than any other parts of speech combined. And so
Right.
that was the point I was just getting to. What do you do whenever it's modifying a noun? To say that the article can turn almost any part of speech into a noun provides no insight into how it functions if the majority of instances in which it occurs.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
and so, and so that's the sort of the starting point here that we need to see is that when it's not a noun, it substantivalizes stuff. Now, again, though, when it is referring to a noun, when it is
Yeah.
modifying a noun, then what is it doing?
Yeah.
So let me skip to that chapter. So the article with nouns. So this is
Mm.
arguably the most important chapter in the book, in my opinion. He says here, nowhere is there more urgent a need for a uniform theory of the article's function than regard to nouns. By
Mm.
an overwhelming majority, nouns are the most common elements to be modified by the article.
Yes.
Yet it is in regard to nouns that historically the function of the article has been treated in a most ununiform and even contradictory manner. For this reason, it is necessary to articulate, no pun intended, a theory that describes how nouns are characterized based on both the article's presence and absence. You see the pun there, right? It's kind of funny, huh? We're
Yes.
talking about the article, and he said articulate. Okay, okay. To accomplish this task, it is essential that we once and for all abandon classical notions regarding the function of the article. By classical, he doesn't mean classical Greek. He means
Mm.
classical in terms of our English traditional understanding of the grammar. The Greek
Mm.
article has not detached itself for special functions, answering generally to those of our word the. So he's saying that the Greek article does not mean the. Okay.
Mm.
It is
Mm.
not quote unquote associated with gesture and aids and pointing out like an index finger. So for instance, if I say, if I say, once upon a time, there was a book on Philip's table, and the book
mm,
was the Bible. So when I
mm,
say the book, I'm referring to I'm particularizing, I'm referring to something specific that is already
mm,
understood or mentioned in the context, right? And
mm.
so that is sort of how the English article works. He's saying that isn't how we should understand the article. I'm just going to read through the whole thing and highlight the points that I highlighted.
So
Such
he
views
says
associate
he says that is not the way how.
that is not the
Uh,
way to understand it.
okay.
Such views associate the Greek article with English th items, which th item is like
The
something you put the in front of. Yes,
mm.
as argued above, it is more closely analogous to English wh items. Actually, I don't know what he's talking about here, but you don't need to understand that to get the point. So let's skip over that. Even the gloss the too often leads to false conclusions. While English idiom will require us to use the definite article in certain structures, it should be approached with caution as a matter of translation. So I think what he's saying here is that you can use the English idiom, but beware that it may lead you to false conclusions.
Huh.
As noted above, historically, attempts to define the function of the article have created their own complications. By stating that the article can turn any part of speech into a noun, one does not define its function with nouns. So we just read that in the previous chapter we looked at. The
Mm,
reason for leaving the treatment of nouns until this point has been to comprehensively demonstrate certain fundamental functions of the Omicron article items in general and the article in particular. So, okay, so here's where he starts breaking down
mm,
the important stuff. Okay. So he says, first, the Greek article indicates that the speaker or writer is providing information that is necessary for identifying a referent. Now, you may say, well, Phil, that sounds very similar to the English use of the word the, and it
mm,
is very similar, but it's not quite the same thing. So let's continue in the
mm,
explanation here. There is no indication that this information is recoverable or obvious in the discourse. So that's a key difference. This is the primary characteristic that distinguishes the Greek article from the English. So in the example I just gave you, once
mm,
upon a time, Philip had a book on his table. The book is the
mm,
Bible. That is also identifying a certain referent, but the difference is that it's a certain referent that you can recover from the context. It's
mm.
understood. It's particularizing something that is already understood.
Right.
But that is not what the Greek article is doing, he says. Second, the function of the Greek article is to characterize the head term as concrete, which he defines as belonging to experience of an actual thing or event, as
Mm.
opposed to the article being purely conceptual,
Huh.
if or abstracted. If this is true when other parts of speech are modified by the article, it is reasonable to conclude that this is its function with nouns as well. Based on this, we will restate the function of the article in terms of how it relates to nouns. So here's what he says. The presence of the article indicates a noun is characterized as belonging to immediate experience as an actual thing or event, or is associated with a specific instance. So
Mm.
that's the summary. Now let me read the full part of what he says. The presence of the article indicates the speaker or writer's subjective presentation of a noun, which is presented as something concrete, in that it is characterized as belonging to immediate experience as an actual thing or event, or is associated with a specific instance. Okay, now that still may sound unclear, so we need to see some more of what he
Mm.
says. In addition, the characterization of a noun as concrete is based solely on the fact of the speaker or writer's provision of the information necessary for identification. It gives no indication to the listener or reader of how or where to locate the identity of the noun. So that's the difference between the English and the Greek.
Interesting.
And that the identity is proximate in such a way as to be immediately recoverable. The Greek article orients the identification of the head term to the speaker or writer, not the recipient. So,
Mm.
in other words,
Mm.
if I'm the Greek guy and I'm writing, whenever I use the article, I
Mm.
am telling you that it's referring to a real thing in the real world, but
Mm.
I'm not telling you anything about specifically who it is per se. It depends on
Mm.
what I'm actually saying in the context, but I don't have to do that. That's not the function of the Greek article. And I'm going to give you an example. It will make all this clear in just a second, but let's
Okay.
continue to go through his explanation.
Mm,
Using these observations regarding the characterization of nouns that are modified by the article, a description of how nouns are characterized when they are not modified by the article may also be formulated. Okay, so again, I think this is important to see both sides. In
mm,
contrast to being characterized as concrete when modified by the article, nouns are characterized as abstract when not modified by the article. I should probably highlight that. That's actually a pretty
mm,
good statement there. Thus, the absence of the article indicates the speaker or writer's subjective characterization of a noun, which is presented as abstract in that it is characterized not as belonging to immediate experience as an actual thing or event, or is not associated with a specific instance. So a specific instance, see, this is where the language is,
mm,
it's very conceptual. It's kind of hard to explain.
mm,
A specific instance is like a specific occurrence of something that really happens or is.
mm, mm,
So that's kind of hard to explain, but
mm,
the noun has no referent in terms of a class whose identifying characteristic is grammaticalized by the noun. It is an abstraction. Okay, so that's a pretty good summary of the use without the article.
mm.
Using these working definitions, we will examine various examples of articular and anarthrous nouns in the New Testament. Okay, so now he's getting into examples, and this is where
Okay.
the James example comes in.
Mm,
Ultimately, it will be demonstrated that the use of the article was not a matter of personal idiom or style, nor was its presence or absence a matter of structural considerations. Instead, it will be demonstrated that Greek speakers employed the article because it entered into a meaningful relationship with the head term, which was a necessary function for establishing meaning. So, in other words, that's just a fancy way of saying the article is extremely important for understanding what the guy is saying. So, I love to take complicated stuff and make it simple, and that's the simple gist of it. There is the Greek article is important for understanding the meaning. Now, let's continue and move into his example, which is so important. What he says,
Mm,
what he's about to say here. One of
mm,
the difficulties we will encounter will be determining the factors that govern a speaker's or writer's choice to characterize the head term as concrete or abstract.
mm,
In some instances, this will be fairly obvious from the discourse. In others, where this is not the case, we will be required to theorize about such motives in a manner that is consistent with what is observable in the discourse. Though challenging, by using the definitions proposed here, this exercise may yield results that provide insights and that have exegetical value. And I can tell you already from the little I've looked into this book and what he proposes here, it really makes a lot of sense, man. Okay,
mm,
anyways, let's keep going. While this may while we may expect many positive results, it is also true that some interpretations will have to be overturned. So here's where he talks about what Wallace says. So, for
mm,
example, Wallace translates James 2:14, which is "me dunete e pisti sose avton," as this faith. In other words, this kind of faith, it's a referring to a specific faith already understood by the audience in Wallace's
mm,
understanding of the translation. This faith is
mm,
not able to save him, is it? And so Wallace translates it that way in his Greek grammar.
mm,
The underlying assumption here is that the article functions like a the word, like the usage in English, and it
mm,
points back to a certain kind of faith as defined by the author and is used to particularize an abstract noun. And
mm,
so that is also what Wallace says in his grammar as well. So here's what he says, what Peter says. Peter says the first part of this interpretation is mostly incorrect. So this part he says is mostly incorrect. It points back to a certain kind of faith as defined by the
mm,
author. That is the English understanding of the article. That's not what the
mm,
Greek is doing. But then he says, because the article does not function as a demonstrative, it does not point back in this way. But
mm.
then he says the second part is nearly correct. So this part, Wallace, is nearly correct. It is used to particularize an abstract noun. That's
Mm,
nearly correct, but it can be improved. So how can it be
mm,
improved? Here's what he says. Rather than say the article particularizes an abstract noun, it is more accurate to say it characterizes the noun as concrete, as pertaining to a particular instance of faith. So it's not that he's referring to a specific faith that's already been referenced. It's that he's
mm,
referring to a particular instance of faith by making the abstract idea of faith concrete and referring to a real instance in the world.
mm.
And so I know that that's very conceptual and that's kind of weird to think about, but
Yeah.
if you take a minute and kind of think through it, I think you'll begin to see it. But let's keep going. Let's keep going. So
I
let's
have a question. So
yeah, go ahead.
what is an instance of faith?
Yeah, see, that's where the language is. That's where we're using like very conceptual terms, and it's kind of weird to it's kind of weird to it's difficult to explain, but
So
an
is that
instance
a
would be
mm,
like an what instance would be like a real world. And so think of it in terms of what it's not. So you have two options here. You have an abstract idea like
mm,
faith, but
mm,
then in Greek, if I say the faith,
mm,
it's taking the abstract idea and it's saying that this is a real world type of faith. But I'm not referring back to a specific faith per se.
mm.
It's more just making the abstract idea and saying, hey, this is a real faith I'm referring to, but you don't know exactly which one I'm referring to. That's the difference between the Greek and
I
the English.
see. I
So it's a
see.
specific
Mm,
instance in the sense that it is a real occurrence in the real world,
mm,
but it's not a particularization the way the English does it as pointing back to an antecedent that is already understood from the
mm,
context per se.
mm,
So I know that's a bit weird to think about, but I'm going to give you another example that
mm,
I think will really make this clear. So,
mm,
but let's keep going here. Let's finish this. Great question.
mm,
While this
mm.
particular instance may be the aforementioned faith, the article does not direct the reader to make this connection. See, that's the thing. It could be a specific faith James is referring to, but that's not what the Greek article is doing. Instead, the
Mm,
identification of faith is based on an orientation to the author. He
mm,
provides the information necessary for identification to the recipients who must accept this information for the purpose of identification. The translation, this faith, indicates that the author is directing the recipients to the information necessary for identification. So that's why this faith doesn't work. It's functioning more like the English understanding. So he's being very specific. You could say it's like fine tuning in a way. This is the same type of thing with the concept fallacy. It's some people may perceive this as fine tuning, but we're actually talking about different concepts. Such an
mm,
interpretation of the article's function misinterprets the dixis of the article or the function of teaching of the article. That's what dixis is
mm,
from deictic. This is not to say that Wallace's rendering is inappropriate. It may be fine as far as idiomatic English is concerned. And see, that's the tricky part. It's just
mm,
like saying we can translate faith as believe if
mm,
you understand it's belief plus action. So
mm.
it's like
Yeah.
this is a very tricky kind of thing. However, he says this rendering does not reflect the Greek usage. Instead, it becomes the basis to read English usage into Greek. Boom, concept
Mm,
fallacy. So
mm,
this is concept fallacy in grammar.
mm,
Now, now this is I want to stop here in his book, and I want to give you a specific example. So I'm going to share with you the recent addition I added to our book
mm,
because I add this in the concept fallacy section. I think this is a really helpful. I think this is a really helpful example. So, and I
mm,
use Wallace's example the as a part of the means to explain it.
mm,
Um, so let me share my screen again and I'll show you what I added. And I think that I've simplified it so it's easier to understand a bit
mm.
in our book.
Okay.
So this is in the concept fallacy section. This is after we
Mm,
talk about the main gist of the concept fallacy and the
mm,
problems relating
mm,
to it. So I say
mm,
another example in terms of Greek grammar. This is in the subsection application for Greek students and
mm,
learning Greek with concept fallacy and this kind of thing.
mm,
Another example in terms of Greek grammar is the function of the definite article, which does not correspond to the English definite article. In Koine Greek, without the article, the word it could be modifying but isn't is more abstract in some way and not tied to a real referent, perhaps because it is giving a quality that the noun describes. It is giving an abstraction. While on the other hand, with the article, the word is no longer merely a concept or abstract idea or quality, but is referring to a real person, thing, or event, an actual
mm,
referent. For example, John 1 1. So I think this is such a great example. The
mm,
idea is that the word is referring to a real person,
mm,
while in the last clause of the verse, it is not referring to God the person per se, but is actually saying something like the word was the quality of God or deity. The
mm,
word, a real person, was with the God, a real person, and the word, a real person, was God or deity, a quality, because God there is not used with the article. And
mm,
so this is getting into like other concepts in grammar that you see as well that are often discussed with John 1 1.
mm,
So that is kind of the idea is whenever you don't have the article, you can think of it like the noun is more like an abstract quality that isn't referring to a specific thing in the real world per se. Whereas
mm,
with the article, it's saying, hey, this is a real person, place, thing, event,
A
according to
concrete thing. Yeah.
a concrete thing, so to speak. So then I summarize what he says in the book that we just read. According
Mm,
to Ronald Peters, in his the Greek article orients the identification of the head term to the speaker or writer, not the recipient. And the key difference, I think, between the Greek and the English article based on what he says. So Wallace translates James 14 as this kind of faith or this faith is not able to save him, is it? So it would be like me sitting here and telling you this faith is not able to save him, is it? So when I say it that way in English, and that's how it would be read, you get the
Mm,
feeling that I'm referring to something specific that you should already understand as the
right.
listener in the
Mm,
context.
mm,
That's not what Greek is doing, as he says. The
mm,
purpose is simply to take the abstract noun and to make it refer to a real thing.
mm,
So Wallace translates James 2:14 as this kind of faith or this faith
mm,
is not able to save him, is it? Peters additionally points out that the assumption of the article points back to a certain kind of faith as defined by the author is incorrect. Peters concedes that Wallace's translation is technically correct in idiomatic English, but it quote unquote does not reflect Greek usage and becomes the basis to read English usage
mm,
into the Greek. This is the kind of problem we all face, I say. Are we
mm,
trying to understand the language the ancient biblical author understood it? Or are we simply creating a pseudo language that mimics English understandings? Now,
mm,
I'm not saying that to criticize Wallace. I'm saying that in general. In
mm,
general, that is the concern we should all have in every aspect of the language, grammar, in terms of
mm,
vocabulary, whatever.
mm,
We have to ask ourselves, are we reading into the understanding an English concept, or are we actually trying to figure out and train ourselves to think the way the Greeks are thinking, the
yeah.
ancient Greek writer is thinking?
Mm,
Again, let me be clear because people always take things the wrong way on our
mm,
channel.
mm,
I'm not doing this to criticize Wallace. Okay, Wallace is a great
mm,
grammarian. He's absolutely wonderful, absolutely brilliant. His book is absolutely an authoritative scholarly source on grammar. However, there are some cases where it seems like there's some concept fallacy at play in some parts of the translation there. And I think that Ronald Peters does a good job of explaining the Greek article
mm,
and pointing out some of this problem. And maybe Wallace doesn't think that. Maybe when he translates this, he doesn't see that.
mm,
And so it's not that he's making a mistake. It's just that whenever we see this particular translation, it can lead us. It can mislead us. It can
yes.
lead us
Mm,
astray if you're not thinking through these issues of this potential for concept fallacy problem. Um,
mm.
and so yeah, that's what I have to share. That's what I added to the book. What do you think about that, man?
So, in English, there's actually no correspondent translation for that specific Greek article because
Mm,
there's no specific English particle
that's
that
right.
that actually substantize something like substantize a concept. Because of course
That's
you can
right.
say
Yeah.
some nouns that but that also changes the how we should understand nouns in Greek because for
Oh
by
yeah.
default Greek people will think nouns whatever noun it is by default they will think of it as an abstract thing they have to not doesn't have to but like they usually use a noun to substantize it to make it something substantial, something people actually experience, not by just mentioning the noun, but also by adding the article before the noun. But in English, when you use a noun, it's like you already understand it in most of the time. You already understand something substantial by referring to the noun already. So I think
Yeah.
the change is
Yeah.
not just merely article, it also changes how we should understand Greek nouns. And if that is the
Mm,
case, there's no one-to-one translation at all, like
that's right.
from Greek
Yeah.
to English when it comes to nouns and articles.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So what that really means is that every English translation is concept fallacy in terms of the article. So, um,
Yes.
yeah. Yeah, man, it's simply a completely different way of thinking, I mean, and it goes to show that it's not just the words and their concepts, it's the way the very language functions is a different way of thinking. So yeah, it's
Mm.
it's a huge thing, and I think that it's worthy of inclusion in our section on concept fallacy and this kind of thing,
Oh,
and things that Greek students should be aware of in the book. And I
right.
think it's helpful. I think it's helpful for what you just said there. It's not just words that we're dealing with that have concept fallacy. It's the very language, like the whole
Mm.
thing. Like we're not arguing within a framework. we're questioning
Mm.
the very framework itself and saying you need
Yes,
to
yes.
adopt a different framework.
That's
And that's
right.
something people don't always think. People don't always get. It's like sometimes people hear what we're saying, I think, and they think they don't understand it because they think we're arguing within an existing framework. No, we're actually saying the whole framework itself.
Hmm.
We're arguing outside of the framework. We're saying the framework is not right. You need to
Right.
replace it with a new framework.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so, yeah, which that's, of course, things get tricky whenever you get to that level. And I think that's
Mm.
why this is a bit hard to describe.
Mm.
But I think once you go through this and you think about it, and once you get it, it's actually very simple. It's actually very
Mm.
simple. It's in English, the article points to something specific that should already be understood.
Mm.
Whereas in Greek, the whole fundamental idea is different entirely. The
Mm.
noun is abstract, but the article makes it refer to something real or concrete. That's so
Mm.
that those are different, two different things completely. Those are two different things completely
Yeah. Mm.
between the English usage and the Greek.
Mm.
So it's very complicated, but it's very simple at the same time. It's like this kind of
Yeah.
thing. Um,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, so 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 that begs the question then. Okay, well, how should we understand James 2:14?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we shouldn't understand it as James referring to a specific faith that you should already understand from context per se.
Mm.
The point of using the article there is that he's not describing it as faith in general, as like an abstract thing. He's
Mm.
saying that a specific instance of faith,
Mm.
which of course would be the Christian faith, the faith that he's talking about, is
Mm.
the faith that he's talking about. And so you could say in effect it's the same thing. You could say that practically speaking, okay, Phil, that still accomplishes in pretty much the same thing as the English article. Okay, but the understanding is different. And if you don't have the right
Mm.
understanding, it can lead you to false conclusions. So maybe James is not a good example to illustrate the potential
Mm.
for false conclusions, but there are
Yeah.
examples that he mentions that could lead you to that. And so,
Yeah, well,
um,
I think you can still say that it's referring to something, but it's not referring to something particularly in the context. It's referring to something that is substantial and in experience. That is to say that he's referring to a to a to something specific that is uh, in terms of that is a reality uh,
yeah,
in contrast to the idea that some theoretical thing. That is to say, okay, I think I can explain this in James 2:14. So in the context of James, James is talking about um, if you only comply to the to the covenant like say like devil they believe God is one but that kind of faith cannot save you, but he is not saying that this kind of faith cannot save you. He is saying that he is basically he is saying that you have this kind of faith in reality, you're experiencing it, it's there. um the faith you experience this way, that faith cannot save you. And he is that's the point he's trying to make. He's not trying to
yeah.
say that the faith that I mentioned here, he's trying to say that the faith you are experiencing in your real life, or I have been experiencing, I in terms of James, James is experiencing in real life, or James is referring to the something that actually happens in a concrete spiritual or physical world. And that is the kind of faith he is trying to refer to. There is a reference, but the reference is in contrast to something conceptual rather than in contrast to something that is arbitrary.
Yeah. In other words, the contrast is to something that could be conceptual, as opposed to in English usage, the contrast would be from particular or specific to non-specific. And
Mm,
so that would be sort of another thing too is that it seems like the Greek article is basically a step undeveloped from the English. I see the English article use understanding as just more developed in its understanding. So it'd
mhm,
be like the difference between saying the faith
mm,
versus this faith. Now, I know those are different words in English, but
mm,
the idea would be like in the Greek, it's just like you're taking the idea and making it concrete. But in English, they take that a step further. Not only are we making it concrete, it's already concrete.
mm,
They're making it specific and particular and understood in context with
mm.
respect to the recipient. And
Yeah.
so I kind of see English, and maybe this is because of English as a modern language, or maybe this is just
Mm,
me, just my mind thinking about these things. But it seems like English is English is more developed in its understanding, whereas
mm.
Greek, you're going back to an ancient. The Koine Greek is more ancient understanding, so they don't think of it in that more developed sense. It
Yeah.
could be like that. The in general though, it's a different concept.
Yeah.
So
Again, I think the how we understand noun is also very crucial because you have to
mm,
understand noun, whatever noun it is, you have to
mm.
understand the noun in terms of it's a uh, abstract thing. Like whenever the
You know what this
noun,
is like? This is very similar to in philosophy. I think this is something from Plato. I think this is
hmm,
Platonic. The idea that you have a perfect representation of something in heaven, and
ah,
then you have the imperfect real world things in the world. It seems kind of similar to that, doesn't it?
that's
It's like
interesting.
so
Yes, yes.
if we take for instance if we take for instance well, this is a bad example, but if we take faith, for instance, it's like
Mm,
you have a perfect idea of what. No, us use a different example because that's a
mm,
let's use like table, like a real world
mm,
thing, like a table, a
mm.
hard table. You have in heaven, in the Platonic philosophy, this perfect table in heaven from
Yes, yes.
which, and so that's the abstract idea, right? That's without
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
article. But then if you add an article to it, you're referring to a real world table
The
that
specific
in
table.
a specific table
Yeah.
that is in the real world. And so the focus is not on unspecific versus specific, though. The
Mm.
focus is on abstract versus you've now brought it into the real world. You're referring
Yeah,
to something in
yeah.
the real world, a real world reference. And so I think in
Mm.
Plato's philosophy, though, he would say that every real world occurrence is an imperfect representation of the heavenly one.
That's
Whereas
interesting.
that may not be the focus in Christianity whenever they use the article in the New
Right,
Testament.
right, right.
I'm
Mm.
not sure, but that may not be the focus. But I think that philosophical underlying understanding may be helpful to understand the article. It seems very comparable.
Well,
So something to think about.
I think
Yeah.
probably like Platonic understanding of the world is rooted in how Greek actually functions
Mm,
in his
mm.
time, and probably he was
Yeah, so it's the
influenced.
other way. So you're
Yeah, yeah,
saying
yeah,
it's the other way. Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah.
It's he is describing something in light of the way the language is understood.
Yes, yes, yes. I think
So
that makes
that
more
would make
sense.
sense. Yeah.
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
that makes sense. Yeah,
That's
that's
right.
so fascinating to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
you have a yeah.
that's why it's very difficult to understand from English perspective or from any modern language perspective. I would think because all the languages nowadays basically they function as everything is concrete. Um,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah, yeah.
maybe I think
Well,
maybe
uh,
German is somewhat different because like
mm,
it has very strange way of using using the articles just like Greek. Um, and
yeah,
so I think that's something interesting to think about. It's not something that always like come across like in our daily speech. You kind of really need to switch your understanding of like how language functions, how your actual speech functions. Like you actually speak, you're actually talking about you use the same word, but you're actually talking about very different things.
yeah,
So like you have to
yeah,
switch the entire mentality of how language is used to refer things,
yeah,
and then to read the New
mm,
Testament, and then you can understand what the writers are talking about, so to speak.
yeah.
So I think it's a very great shift in terms of mentality and mindset.
I think something we should also make more clear, I guess I could do this, make more clear in the book is the verbal aspect thing is also kind of like a concept fallacy thing,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
the verbal aspect is a completely different way of understanding the way the
yeah.
verb works and the language in general works in Greek.
That's right.
It's not based on tense or time, it's based on aspect. And so that focus is almost like a concept fallacy thing. Whenever you read Greek, if you think of it in terms of tense, you're missing you're missing the real way of thinking about it. And it goes back to what I said here, I think. I think this is
mm,
I love what I said here, but
mm,
are we trying to really understand the language the way they understood it? Or
mm.
are we trying to or are we just creating a pseudo language that mimics the English usage?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So see, that's something that we all have to worry about. The more that I study Greek, the more that I think that we shouldn't translate it because it just
You can't.
we
Can't. You're
should
not able
translate it.
to.
We should,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, it's like uh, there's so many problems like this.
Yeah.
It would be better to just learn Greek, and that's why I
I
teach Greek. That's why I'm happy to
honestly,
teach Greek. So
after I finished reading the verbal aspect book, I feel like the Greek. I have more feeling about Greek as an ancient language rather than something modern.
yeah,
Because
this too, like
yeah,
actually all this stuff, like all this stuff together, like our research in
mm,
the words themselves and understanding certain words that seem to be abstract or like statuses to
mm,
us are actually defined by action to
yeah,
see that you have it's primarily oriented about
mm,
relation or aspect in terms of the verb, to see things like
mm,
this with the article. I mean,
yeah,
all this stuff together, it makes me think in a completely different way.
yes,
Um,
yes, yes,
yeah,
yeah.
it's all very different, and it does give you that more of like it does feel more like an ancient understanding when you put it
Yeah,
all
yeah.
together.
And actually, if you
Yeah,
compare Greek with like other ancient languages like Hebrew, Phoenician, this type of language, you will see that they actually function pretty similarly grammatically, not just in the content they write, but also like grammatically there are a
mm,
lot of similarities. Like I said, I mentioned that when I share with you my thought on on the verbal aspect book, it seems that the function of different tense forms in Greek is very similar to in the narrative. It's very similar to how vowel consecutive functions in Hebrew narrative, like marking the mainline story and offline background information material, things like that.
yeah,
This
yeah.
kind of contrast. So it really makes Greek more ancient I think um, Campbell said something uh, very important. We used to understand tradition in terms of traditional Western scholarship. Traditionally, people try to understand Greek from the perspective of Latin. Now you kind of need to shift that paradigm. You no longer
Mm,
understand Greek in terms of Latin and any other Roman languages, like whether it's English, whether it's English is
mm,
kind of dramatic too, but French or any of this type of language, you have to like entirely shift that, change that, throw that out of the window, and then re-understand the Greek from another linguistic perspective, from ancient Indo-European linguistic perspective to see Greek, and that's a very great paradigm shift. Even though from a historical perspective, it's like people already know that, like they know that it's a very like ancient language, but you don't really
mm,
study when it comes to the actual study of the Greek language. People don't really study the language from the perspective of an ancient language. They project their understanding of later language, later in linguistic development in Western Europe to understand Greek, and that's
mm,
the dilemma we've caught in because it's easier for us to understand the language, but it totally miss the point of how the language actually function. So I think
mm.
that's the paradigm shift that we need to make here.
Yeah. I every time I have a little paradigm shift like this, I try to reread like portions of the New Testament, or the Gospels, and
Yeah,
try to incorporate that understanding. And it does give you a very different picture. It does paint a very
yeah,
different picture sometimes. So
that's right.
it's very important. Yeah, it's definitely very important. Yeah, thanks for watching. Keep seeking the truth, everyone.